It's really about ensuring that the resources that a business relies on to create the wealth it does for its investors, its stakeholders, it's managed in a way that actually sustains it for future generations.
Welcome to The Greener Way. I'm Rose Mary Petrass, Senior Journalist at FS Sustainability. We are recording on Gadigal land. We pay our respects to traditional custodians of country and elders past, present and emerging. ESG regulation is evolving fast, whether it's mandatory sustainability-related reporting, modern slavery regulations, or circular economy laws. This episode, we're going to break down exactly what you need to know. Let's dive into a global update with Andrew Peterson. Andrew wears many hats, as you'll learn by the end of this episode, but primarily he is the CEO of the Business Council for Sustainable Development Australia. Welcome to the show, Andrew.
Thank you, Rose, and thank you for the invitation. I'm coming to you from Camaragal land, so the neighbouring land of the Gadigal people.
Andrew, is it all getting a bit confusing for businesses when it comes to ESG laws, and how can businesses keep up in this constantly changing regulatory environment?
It's a very good question, isn't it? I think that it's not that confusing if you've been tracking it for a while, as not just myself, but a lot of practitioners in this space have been doing for some time. If you're coming new into it, yes, it looks like a hodgepodge of acronyms. The famous TLAs, three-lettered acronyms, are incredibly overwhelming. But to a certain extent, that's a reflection of the incredible amount of work that's been done over a number of years. It's almost coming to fruition in terms of then forming the framework of reporting on a variety of issues, of which the concept of ESG, I think, is just one of them. The broader Sustainable Development Agenda has other issues as well. But in terms of how to deal with it, it's a very interesting moment in time for practitioners to really get a handle on preparing themselves for the reporting or the transparency or the accountability, if you want to put it that way, that's going to come down the line. So it's not an easy thing to do. You do definitely need to be on top of what is going on, I think, in the three big areas, which are climate, equity, human rights, diversity, inclusivity, and nature. They are probably the three big, and they're certainly the three big pillars of work that we focus on with our members.
In terms of comparing Australia with our international peers, are we keeping up or are we falling behind?
Yeah, the question it's a perennial question, isn't it, about is Australia a leader or a laggard in sustainability? I like to think of it as, if you kind of examine our standing compared to global leaders, it really is like assessing our pace in a marathon for green leadership. And the key question then is, well, how can Australian policies evolve to ensure that we not only keep pace, but we lead in this sustainability innovation, particularly in climate or decarbonisation now? Australia really has actually pioneered in some areas, like solar energy adoption, for example, where we actually lead globally. And I think that's to be acknowledged. However, in sectors like electrical vehicle uptake, and for that matter, I guess, sustainable agriculture at the moment, we lag in relation to the adoption rates by other countries like Norway or Brazil. But I think that mixed performance actually suggests then that there's probably a need for a nuanced policy approach that actually accelerates the areas of lag while actually bolstering the current strengths and promoting a comprehensive green transition.
Walk us through exactly what practitioners need to know about the global regulations at the moment, and also how to navigate cross-border requirements where there might be differences in the laws between countries.
So that's a really, really difficult question to answer at the moment, because we're on the threshold of understanding whether or not we're going to see this funny thing called interoperability. In other words, are we going to actually find some sort of harmonised reporting framework in all of these areas, whether it's climate, whether it's nature, whether it is equity, in the guise of human rights and modern slavery, for example. But if you look at it from the perspective that sustainable development's becoming truly global in the way that global trade has occurred, in the way that global economics has manifested the financing of investment in companies over time. That whole notion of globalization is coming really fast into the sustainable development area. And that's very true in relation to reporting and accountability. So the way we like to explain it to our members is that particularly the global sustainability regulations, we like to think of it like the tightening of belts on a machine. So in this case, it's the corporate machine, because we want to ensure that businesses operate smoothly and more sustainably by creating wealth in new areas and perhaps getting out of areas that are not actually sustainable going forward. And in that regard, the most important framework is actually the Sustainable Development Goals. And the Sustainable Development Goals have now been around for over 7 years, and they provide for a lot of countries and companies and communities two very vital things. The first is a framework for discussion around the key challenges that humanity faces. And why is that? Because it's kind of like a baseline of understanding of what the key issues are, whether that is in relation to education, whether it's in relation to inequality, whether it's climate action, whether it's life below water, or whether it's my favourite, SDG 8, which is decent work and economic growth. You have this baseline of understanding and a comparability of conversation on what are the key challenges, not just for business, but also for their stakeholders. The other really important thing that we drive, and colleagues like our friends at the UN Global Compact also drive, is that these SDGs also have targets and indicators. So they actually give you a sort of the roadmap about how you start to think about the way in which your business model is going to reflect and it's going to react to the challenges, the risks associated with future growth. And in that regard, obviously, SDG 12, which is responsible consumption and production, and SDG 13, which is climate action, they actually serve as a blueprint or a benchmark for companies to start striving to meet international standards. Now, what we now see is that there are these key details around standard setting, which is the International Sustainability Standards Board work, S1 and S2, which are now trickling into national legislation and will be create obligations for companies and other organisations. It'll apply to NGOs as well. And you also have work being done on setting standards. So whether that's the work of the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, you've got the historical important work in relation to human rights, which is translated incredibly quickly into regulation on modern slavery, for example. So when you track it in terms of the work that's been done both globally and to a certain extent locally, you can see that we're coming to a new pivot in relation to the expectation that those standards or that regulation or that policy framework that's going to be put in place is not just because countries or communities want businesses to be regulated. No, what they want to do is create a new robust framework for a new type of economy that responds to the challenges that have been identified in the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, let me give you a few examples on that. So the TCFD, the famous Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, and what an acronym that is, gave really interesting guidelines to encourage companies, that was the word, to encourage companies to disclose financial risks related to climate change. And what was really interesting about that is Australia led the way. AGL and BHP were two companies that integrated the TCFD guidelines very, very early on in their reporting framework so they could better position themselves to attract investment and to adhere to global or international standards. The other one, obviously, now is the development of the ISSB S1 and S2, as they're called. And remarkably, during the consultation phase of that, the development of that standard or those standards, the submissions from Australia, including from the business sector, outnumbered those from any other country. So it goes back to your earlier point, are we lagging? No, I don't think we do. We play an active role. What we need to do is keep playing that role and show what our participation in our circumstances in Australia have in relation to the realisation of these standards, which then often turn into regulation. Now, what we're doing at the BCSDA with our colleagues at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, which we are the Australian partner, We're actually recently announced a preparer forum on sustainability disclosures, and that's going to further enable business to align their sustainability reporting with international expectations, including Australia's. So it's designed to help and build as a platform for sharing best practice and then enhancing the quality of sustainability reports.
I'm sure that will certainly be very helpful for businesses. And now, we're seeing the TNFD, the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures, being adopted. And we're also seeing the Task Force on Social Inequality-related Financial Disclosures being developed in its early stages. As you mentioned, sustainable development is a much broader discussion than just ESG for corporations. You work with the Business Council for Sustainable Development Australia. What is the role of business leadership in driving action for sustainable development, and what progress are we seeing in this area?
Yeah, that's a really, really interesting question. I think that we're starting to see a crystallisation and a bit of a maturation about what business leadership means in sustainable development. It really does go past formal roles, whether that's a CEO or a CFO or the CSO, which is the Chief Sustainability Officer, which is a term of art that's probably more widely used overseas than it is in Australia. But I think the leadership notion is that it cuts across all of those roles, and it embodies a commitment and a cultural, deeply rooted approach to consistently driving change, not only within the organisation and now its supply chain, but also through its industry participation and its role in that sector, and then also amongst its stakeholders. Now, whether they're investors, whether they are their suppliers, whether they are their consumers, whether they are government, it's a different type of conversation. Practically, the steps include not just evaluating financial performance, but also then thoroughly understanding and addressing, so action, and then accounting for through your report, your non-financial performance reporting, whether that's a sustainability report, an integrated report, an addendum to your financial report, for those issues on social and environmental impacts that are actually associated with the company generating economic value. And what's interesting about that is it's really about ensuring that the resources that a business relies on to create the wealth it does for its investors, its stakeholders, it's managed in a way that actually sustains it for future generations. So in Australia, that's coming to a point where it's going to be realised in regulation to a certain extent. But I think that we've had that in place now for some time, whether that's through reporting under the Global Reporting Initiative, whether that's the obligations under the Corporations Law. These are all examples, and perhaps they're imperfect examples, but they're definitely examples of companies showing to their stakeholders, not reporting for an obligation purpose, but to actually show the result of creating economic value where you take into account social and environmental factors that have an economic impact.
Mm-hmm.
My prime example of that is the work of one of our members, which is Foraco, which is a timber company timber management company in Tasmania, which published the very first set of natural capital accounts.
Mm-hmm.
And that was to show the economic value of nature on their books. Now, that was groundbreaking because it's the first.
Mm-hmm.
It underpins work that's been done by one of our partners, which is the Capitals Coalition, that's been working on natural capital protocol for some number of years. And it's an example of work that's been done in the forestry sector, of which the World Business Council has a number of members, as do we, that wants to show the value created in a different environment in which deforestation, challenges in relation to impact on biodiversity are factors that these companies are starting to take into account in relation to the action that they want to put in place to address risk, create strategic opportunity, and then account for it.
Now, you also work with the Australian Packaging Covenant Organisation to reduce the environmental impact of packaging in Australia, as well as advise the Victorian government on circular economy opportunities for business. According to the Sustainable Procurement Disclosure Index, in 2022, Just 11% of Australia's top 200 listed companies comprehensively disclose their sourcing practices. Are you seeing progress in this area in Australia?
Yes, but not fast enough, and certainly not at a scale which is going to create new market opportunities for those players who want to come into the market and support that kind of leading edge practice. Our work, or my work, as a skills-based director on the board of the Australian Packaging Covenant Organisation, very long-winded name, just almost as long as ours, is a really interesting insight into a co-regulated entity, because it is ostensibly run by business, but it has a government mandate or a policy mandate under the National Environment Pollution Measure. And with that, you've got, I think, a stark realisation that the linear economy that we've been operating in, and this is obviously a conversation that's only come about fairly recently, but the work of Gail Sloan at the Waste Management Resource Recovery Association and others, including APCO, Planet Arc, and all these have been articulating that we can't continue on the historical approach of production and consumption, which has no consequences in relation to the waste that's created from it. And that, I think, is something that business also, in its own private way, has been talking about for years, because the thing is, waste is unrealised value. It's leaving money on the table because you have had the consequence of something being produced that has some output that you can't use. The question is, can it be used for something else? And can, for that matter, the product that you've created then have another life after you have initially used it? That goes to a broader question around this notion of circular economy, which is, how do you build in this notion of circularity? In other words, it gets used, reused again, and or it's designed in such a way that it can be dismantled and repurposed for some other use into the future. So the work of APCO has led to the development of the national packaging targets. The work of the Victorian government recently on circularity is about investing in infrastructure for a Victorian circular economy, aiming, I think, ultimately to make Australia, and that's consumers as well as producers. Let's be clear here. We're not just talking about business being responsible for it, because business responds to a consumer need, a consumer demand, or creates the consumer opportunity as a result of the product. But taking in at that very front end the work of how you design out waste, in other words, unrealised value. And with that, the importance then of the procurement officer in wanting to ensure that they align. I go back to my earlier point about the obligation of senior leadership around sustainable development. It's in the procurement officer's mandate to do as well. So product coming forward into a company, is it of such high quality that it can be used again and again by the company? When it's finished its life with the company, can it be then repurposed for something else? Or is there a process in which the procurement officer with its supplier can actually think about designing out the way in which that particular product is wasteful? Now, that's a really tricky thing in a country where we have an economic model that doesn't enable that kind of innovation, because a lot of sectors have primarily two major players going on. And so you had the inherent challenge of competition being the thing that drives trying to get market share and therefore creating profit. That has to be overcome, and it can only be overcome by government intervening, because it has to play the incubator and the broker role of enabling these types of products and these types of processes to be rethought in an environment that's in a non-competitive space. And that's the role of APCO to a large extent. It's definitely the role of governments to play. And you talked about procurement officers. Well, you've heard, and I'm no doubt talked about in FS Sustainability, the role of the government procurement process that's changed quite remarkably recently. And with that, that's going to drive new opportunities for new product and process, hopefully, to come forward that is more circular than we have at the moment, and thereby drive up that 11%.
Well, thank you so much for your time today, Andrew. You've managed to take what could be quite a dry subject matter, that is regulations and standards, and made it interesting and understandable. I'm sure our listeners will agree. Where can people find out more about the work of the BCSDA?
So to navigate the currents of sustainable development that are challenging us all at the moment, strongly encourage you to go onto our website, which is www.bcsda.org.au, and to sign up and get a taste of our new news service, business intelligence service called ESG Snapshot, which you can actually access for 6 weeks in a free trial. And then if you want to, you can then join as a member. And we have member categories that you can pick that are relevant to your organisation, and keep in touch and keep informed about all the things that we've just been talking about on this podcast.
Great. Thanks, Andrew. I'm Rose Mary Petrass, and that is a wrap for today.
The Greener Way podcast is a product of FS Sustainability, a show about people, the planet, and investing in our collective future. All information in this podcast is for education and entertainment purposes only. The Greener Way podcast gives listeners access to information and educational content provided by discussing numerous financial sustainable options and our featured guests. It is not intended as a substitute for professional, legal, or tax advice. The hosts of The Greener Way are not financial professionals and are not aware of your personal financial circumstances. Before making any financial decisions, you should read the product disclosure statement, and if necessary, consult a licensed financial professional. For more information, head to the disclaimer page on the FS Sustainability website, fssustainability.com.au.